Welcome to the Antedote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg and Karen.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Jeremy, we're already up to part 5 on our series from 9/11 to 11/9, and during our first 4 episodes, we've started, I think, going from a general broad overview of the idea of, I think, our general overview or general goal with this program is to just show the similarities in terms of what we have identified as two very major, obviously very major events, defining events in our time, and how really I think the 9/11 operation, which of course was the events of September 11, 2001, and what we've come to identify as 11/9, the actual morning of the election of Donald Trump, which of course was the day after the actual election when everyone voted, and how these two events correlate with a number of the same players, a number of the same connections in terms of both ideological as well as individual connections and group connections, and just the correlation between these events and how they really do seem to serve as a continuation of it seems a longer term agenda. And a little later on, when we get into talking about some of the aspects perhaps involving, say, a General Michael Flynn and connections to John Singlaub and what that might identify in terms of a longer term operation, we'll maybe go back to that later. But in general, I think in the process of laying out this, I think this larger overall narrative of our idea in mind to just tie these events together, and not just the events themselves, but the bigger agenda that I think both of these events at their deepest levels appear to really correlate with, and are in a lot of ways a continuation of a much longer term agenda that really, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, when you look back 17 years later at September 11th, as well as current events in relation to this whole Russia narrative, as well as other events going on in the globe, not only in the Middle East, but globally, I think you do see a major correlation. And then in the process of that, we've been in the last couple episodes talking about a lot of the individual players, some of the on the ground aspects of September 11th, as well as some of the psychological manipulations as far as narratives are concerned, the framing of narratives in the post September 11th world. And there's a major correlation with all of that. And in this episode, I guess we're going to start off with somewhat of a follow up of what we were getting into at the end of our show last week, where you read this. We talked about the Fort Lee, New Jersey aspect of the September 11th operation, then got into some of the names of various figures who do tie into the Trump presidency and all of the aspects and entities and groups surrounding Trump and aspects surrounding Trump and their connections, connecting someone such as a Witkoff to the September 11th operation, also being very close to Trump. I think we're going to follow up on that. I know you wanted to start with an article regarding the firing of a top the National Security Council figure.
They call him an Israeli nuclear spy, but I think he must have been in the State Department. But okay. I'll get to that in 1 second.
Okay.
That I did want to just sort of bring people back into this geography really briefly, and that we were dealing with Fort Lee, New Jersey as a staging ground for this most massive part of the 9/11 operation. And coincidentally or not, I think actually as we begin to lay out, that that's also geographically where there's this strong connection to this Russian Jewish mob syndicate that really, it's maybe even bigger than that in a certain way, bigger than just Russian and bigger than just Jewish, but it's very much the axis of it in terms of key capitals does seem to be an axis between Moscow and Tel Aviv. And so in a certain way, it represents the global conjoining in many ways of the old Soviet sphere. So a lot of these mobsters are not necessarily from Russia, but they're from some of the stands or, from Ukraine or Kazakhstan. And we've also drawn out some of the geography in terms of Eastern Europe and this Hungary connection in relationship to Arthur Finkelstein on the come up, Viktor Orban, who calls him Finky, Putin, Netanyahu, Mogilevich there in the background, and there's key parts of Robert Friedman's book, The Red Mafia, that I believe deals with the how many bombings were going on probably in Budapest, surrounding this Mogilevich organization. So that's a deep aspect of this Soviet sphere in relationship to the Jewish state, and then also a global mob that is tied together, it seems, in many ways, in relationship to this Jewish mob syndicate, but it appears to be ethnically potentially more diverse than that. But that seems to be the tying configuration here between this aspect of September 11th, the geography, Fort Lee, and I read last time through a series of some key coordination that aspects of potentially of this mob set were actually doing in conjunction maybe with more state level covert operators, mainly with a heavy anchor out of Israel in relationship to 9/11. And so I want to go back to that a little bit and finish off the last piece of that article. Because also, as we pointed out, that when you begin to trace this forward, this mob connection becomes blatant in relationship to the 11/9 Trump operation. And yet, in the background are some of the same players, which would include these domestic players, which I think we'll get into a little bit more later, including people like Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, was the first person tasked to head up the 9/11 Commission until he was called out for being too openly compromised by some of the victims' family members. So there is, again, this sort of similar set related in a certain way to both this 9/11 and this 11/9 operation. But this Russian mob, shorthand, let's call it, is much more front and center now in relationship to Donald Trump because of the real estate connection and the apparent money laundering over decades and decades, and how tightly this is connected more to this Russian sphere rather than sort of most intensely tied to this Middle Eastern Israel-Saudi sphere from 9/11, although that's also here. So I'm just going to finish up reading the end of this Fort Lee article, Mapping 9. It has different titles sometimes, but the one I'm reading is called Mapping Fort Lee, The Truth Behind 9/11, published by Gordon Duff on May 23rd, 2015. And people can go look at this because what it also is not just words. There's a lot of actual photos that are apparently straight from, I believe, what aspects of the FBI were doing in terms of counterintelligence and counterterrorism operations in following these operations. So there's geography, there's maps and points that are pointed out in terms of where everything was, including these safe houses, these jammers on top of these, what Veterans Today has labeled these JINSA, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, or now it's America, condo high-rises, Mossad art students, Mohammed Atta, Port Authority Dispatch, an FBI Able Danger secret headquarters, and then the bomb that was apparently intended to take down the George Washington Bridge, which, as I pointed out before, has been identified by Gordon Duff to have been a key connector in terms of information technology infrastructure, in terms of the Wall Street, the financial system, SWIFT banking, and that part of the potential intent was to take that down. But then I'll read the last part of this article and then bounce back to where we ended up last week. Jammer high-rises as seen from FBI Able Danger parking lot. The real purpose of the 9/11 attack was much more than taking down the World Trade Center. Imagine New York City, the WTC evaporated, the George Washington Bridge sitting in the Hudson, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels flooded, hundreds drowned, and the city entirely cut off in full panic mode while police and fire radios were jammed. Were other attacks on Washington foiled as well? The White House or Capitol building targets? Could martial law have been declared? Worse? In the end, we got the Department of Homeland Security. This reminds me of the Len Deighton book SSGB, a fictional tale of Britain's Scotland Yard working for the German SS after Hitler's successful invasion of the UK. We got the DHS after losing a war with AIPAC. You just can't make this stuff up. VT requests that the officers who arrested the Israeli suspects with the quote, thousands of pounds of explosives, unquote, CNN, or who were captured, quote, as the van exploded, unquote, come forward. We also ask that all the witnesses of the second plane that was allowed to fly out of the U.S. that day come forward to confirm that it carried the, quote, exiting, unquote, Israeli team, including the above-mentioned ones who were caught. We know who authorized the plane to leave, a key aspect of the operation, including the New York City law enforcement officials that performed some magic tricks that day. And what they're referring to, right, in terms of that second plane is what we've reported on before in reading through, I believe, a Wayne Madsen and Christopher Bolin have both reported on this plane that we're very aware from things like Fahrenheit 9/11, Michael Moore's film, I believe it was in there, about the flying out of all of the Saudi elite and people connected to bin Laden on September 11th. But who among us has really heard about this Israeli flight, this El Al flight that was apparently coordinated by some high-level Pentagon official and took off with these exiting teams? So that's a great point.
That's a great point.
So I want to just jump back into this article that I brought up at the very end of our last recording, titled "Debunking the 28 Pages, Top Secret 9/11 Document Revealed" by Jeff Smith on July 19th, 2016. And before I jump back into this diagram and explain it a little bit with some more background, I do want to jump into this article that you mentioned, Greg, that came out right. This must have been like right after the inauguration, I would imagine, right? This is it's titled "IAEA Source: Trump Fires Accused Israeli Nuclear Spy Tom Countryman," by Gordon Duff on January 29th, 2017.
Yeah.
But then there's a picture of Tom Countryman. It says "Accused Nuclear Spy Tom Countryman Fired by Tillerson."
Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting.
And that's interesting. It's interesting, especially in regards to when you consider like the war within the deep state, so to speak. The two primary enemies of like the pro-Trump, very Zionist friendly pro-Trump movement were H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson, who were both seem to be moving a lot of more hawkish Zionist partisans within their various departments that they were in charge of. So, and then of course they were both removed by people who seem to at least are much more friendly to this more hawkish pro-Zionist agenda of the Trump administration, that being Bolton and Pompeo respectively. So
that's a great point. And also it might be pointed out that it was this was also Russia. This is allegedly was Russia's favorite pick for Secretary of State, was the oil man Tillerson, who had these deep long-term connections with the Russian government and through his ExxonMobil when he was the CEO, and that they had plans to work on something like a $500 billion project of some sort. And so to me, it sort of reminds me a little bit of these some of these foreign policy splits between the sort of these old school oil guys and these sort of Zionist war hawks of some sort, and especially in relationship to something like Iraq, and going back to our show about the war for oil for Israel, the Iraq war for oil for Israel, really sort of got into that whole false dichotomy that was created about a limited or even red herring about that the invasion of Iraq was about American oil interests. And so then that sort of covered up that there was oil interests. Obviously, Iraq was and is a major source of oil in the world, but it was very much tied into these deeply Israeli networks that we laid out in that program that related very much to this Gary Vogler book about the politics of oil. I think that's what it was, and showing that the people who had been put in charge of this oil operation in Iraq were very much Israeli partisans, if not Israeli agents, such as one Michael Makovsky, identified by Gary Vogler as having trained in the Israeli Foreign Service establishment, and then Vogler saying that his intelligence community contacts in the U.S. said 98% of Israeli Foreign Service are intelligence. So basically, the so-called U.S.-Iraq oil policy being put in the hands of what was very likely, blatantly someone who was trained in the Israeli Foreign Service, but then also someone who was very likely also trained as an intelligence operative by a foreign state. And then also that then links up, of course, with where did Makovsky end up is at Jinsa. All right, so there we see this again. This sort of the Russian interests in relationship to this 11/9 operation seem to be a lot having to do with things like business ties, sanctions, sort of trying to eliminate sanctions, increase certain potential money laundering ability to get money flowing back and forth. And then you see Tillerson taken out and replaced by the kind of people that you mentioned, Bolton and Pompeo, who are much more heavily tied into this hardcore Zionist warmonger set. So thank you for pointing that out, Greg. So I'm just going to read the first part of this article to just give a sense of who Jeff Smith is, who is the go-to person on this article about debunking the 28 pages, and who apparently helped supply veterans today with some of the actual 9/11 investigation via FBI-abled danger, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, looks like faithful, patriotic operatives. So, by Gordon Duff with Jeff Smith, VT editors. When Secretary of State Tillerson fired Tom Countryman, we have no idea why, but here at VT, Countryman is well known. While at the IAEA, VT editor Jeff Smith investigated Countryman for his role in passing nuclear weapons secrets to Israel, including the, quote, pit matching specifications, unquote, that allowed 350 stolen nuclear pits to be paired and remachined in Israel. According to sources, including a high-ranking former White House advisor working with the FBI investigating Israeli espionage, Countryman's stolen nuclear secrets were passed by Bush, quote, terror czar, unquote, Richard Clarke, directly to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Our source was at the Israeli embassy reception as part of the group with Netanyahu, Condoleezza Rice, and Paul Wolfowitz when Clarke turned over the materials, printed in bulk. FBI agents outside recorded the whole thing as one of the attendees, based on a secret agreement with Rice, was carrying a recording device. Yes, we have this quality of information, which has been in the hands of a Houston grand jury since 2007. Then it shows a picture of Bill Richardson, and it's titled Former Democratic Governor of New Mexico and Director of the Department of Energy Bill Richardson, listed as a, quote, leak source, unquote, for missing nuke secrets. The pits were stolen from the Pantex facility in Amarillo. through an operation run by imprisoned, quote, Lord of War, unquote, Victor Bout, working for Israel. The pits, according to our sources who ran the investigation, were removed in refrigeration trucks and taken to a fertilizer plant in West Texas. Then it has a picture of a massive explosion, aftermath of an explosion from this fertilizer plant in West Texas. From there, they were taken to the port of Houston and loaded for transit to the Canary Islands. From there, they were loaded on planes for Mauritius, where they were stored for sorting at an iron mine owned by former South African Prime Minister de Klerk. Then it shows a picture of, it's titled VT editor Dmitry Kolozov in the background with Victor Bout in Thailand. And we'll put Kolozov aside for now, but he's an important whistleblower of some sort, and he's a former Soviet nuclear intelligence officer, and people can go look up his interview that he did with Kevin Barrett that describes what he knows about the history of nuclear explosions and tactical nuclear explosions that include things like the infamous Vela incident off the coast of South Africa, I believe in '79, that is now widely recognized to have been a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test. But he also has identified things like the 83 Marine barracks bombing, I believe, within southern Lebanon, as also having a micronuclear signature. And he also identifies he says direct man-to-man testimony that Michael Harari, the infamous Mossad operations officer for decades, who worked hand in hand with the Bush CIA gang in relationship to even things like Iran-Contra, but also the Panama and all of the weapons and drug flow down through Central and South America, that Harari had said basically that he was celebrating his role in helping organize 9/11 when they were in Thailand together, I believe, the morning after. So we'll leave that aside for now, but people should go look into Dmitry Kolosov's testimony and see what they think of it. So this is a picture that they have where Victor Bout is in the foreground and then Dmitry Kolosov is in the background, and this is in Thailand. Back to the article. When President Clinton ordered the investigation shut down in 1997, former President George H.W. Bush financed it personally, bringing the team of Jeff Smith and Roland Carnaby to Houston. Carnaby was murdered by Israeli security dressed as a Houston police officer in 2005. Assisting the investigation were John Wheeler III, murdered and his body dumped in Delaware, John O'Neill, killed on 9/11, and FBI agent Mike Dick, at one time put on a shoot-to-kill order by, quote, mistake, unquote. The story goes on. Read the Guardian version below and background material from VT below that. And I'll just read this little synopsis here. Guardian. The sudden dismissal of several senior officials has left a gaping hole at the heart of U.S. diplomacy. The machinery is still there, but no one is in the cockpit. Thomas Countryman was on his way to Rome for an international meeting on nuclear weapons on Wednesday when he found out he had been summarily removed from his position. The senior diplomat turned around and got on the first flight back to Washington. It was a sudden and unceremonious end to 35 years as a Foreign Service officer, the last 4 months of it as the acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. But Countryman was not alone. The Trump White House carried out an abrupt purge of the State Department's senior leadership last week, removing key officials from posts that are essential to the day-to-day running of the department and U.S. missions abroad. All right, so there's a lot more to this story, but I'm going to put that aside for now. And Greg, do you have any comments on that and anything more around Tillerson and this potential split, or no?
I'm going to let you keep reading for right now.
Okay. So moving on to this article that I brought up at the end of our last recording, debunking the 28 pages top secret 9/11 document revealed. This is right around when the 28 pages were released. and pointed out that the top half of it is very much the what we might identify as the intelligence side of the September 11th operation, where you have the Bandar Bush's wife and bin Faisal al-Assad and Omar Bayoumie's wife and Osama Basnan's wife via Riggs Bank to Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar, Flight 77 allegedly, and box with the 9/11 hijackers connected back through BCCI, plus Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda into the Safari Club. And then it has a list down of Saudi Arabia, and then Israel is in a box, and then Israel connects down to Israeli Mossad, and then Paul Kurzberg, which when you go scan to the right, you have the list of Sivan Kurzberg, Yaron Shmuel, Omer Marmari, Dominic Suter, or Neat Suter, and these are usually the people that are associated with these are the urban moving systems. The company, the moving company, the Mossad aligned moving company, and also the so-called dancing Israelis. But on the other side here, it tracks back directly from Israel and via Paul Kurzberg into what's identified as Jewish Agency BOG. And Jewish Agency BOG means Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency, which is one of the oldest, I think it is the oldest specifically Jewish organization that's been involved in not only the creation but the sustaining of the Jewish state in its current form. And I believe it's almost 100 years old. And by the way, it turns out that the woman who was asking a question right behind me, right after me, while we were being, while I was being, grabbed, and while we were both being forced out of the Kansas City Public Library Truman Auditorium during interlocution with former Ambassador to Israel Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross also tied into some of these, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, AIPAC associated, pretty hardline think tank, but also we during that about the Iraq War for oil for Israel, we talked about, I believe, how Ross was involved in authoring the Iran policy documents in relationship to people from JINSA, and also one Ash Carter, the former Secretary of Defense. Who also, by the way, I believe we identified also was involved in writing up this paper that prefaced 9/11 by a few years, along with one Philip Zelikow, who ultimately took Henry Kissinger's place, became the official myth maker of 9/11, wrote up according to Philip Sheenan in his book about the 9/11 Commission, wrote up the outline for the 9/11 Commission before it even really got formed, before the commissioners really sat down to investigate. And then also John Deutsch, I believe, was the third.
And that's coming from Sheenan, someone who I think very much adheres the official September 11th narrative, saying that about Zelikow. So what does that tell you?
Exactly. And actually, there's some interesting We Are Change LA video that I made probably more than 10 years ago, where we have an encounter with Philip Sheenan and go over some of these Israeli spy networks with him. And it's pretty interesting. So people can go and find that. But just what I was pointing out in terms of Dennis Ross is when the woman who asked the question right after me, and she talked about what can we do to take on those at the UN who have this the human rights and that whole agenda, or something like that. She happens to have been the representative to the Jewish Agency Board of Governors for Israel, basically, for the local Jewish Federation organization. And the other reason I wanted to bring up the just Jewish Agency Board of Governors is that the key figure there, who sat at the top for probably more than a decade, I think, is one Natan Sharansky, who we will get into later in this program or in later programs, who is a key figure in all of this, both in terms of the allegations around his acceptance of basically blatant mob money through a guy named Luchansky, but also the role that he played as the somewhat, he was sort of the progenitor of this whole concept of the new anti-Semitism, and linking this idea of anti-Semitism to criticism of Israel as the Jewish state. And he also was apparently the go-to for George W. Bush. His book was a go-to for George W. Bush in terms of the PR version, or maybe George W. Bush believed it, I don't know, but this idea of the spreading of democracy, that these aggressive warfare operations against the Likud's Israeli so-called enemies was not about aggressive warfare. It was about spreading democracy, and that everyone would be better. It was a win-win situation, and that comes directly out of Natan Sharansky, who until very recently sat at the top of this Jewish Agency Board of Governors. So that is very interesting. So this is, and once again, the source is said to be FBI Able Danger, classified, quote, top secret /SC, unquote, files on 9/11. This is who the FBI believed was responsible for 9/11 from the suppressed investigation. So then from Jewish Agency Board of Governors, there's a dotted line down to Eitan Wertheimer, and it says $250,000. And that $250,000 there is describing this, what's seen as maybe a loan of some sort, but it's potentially a questions about this loan to one Bernard Kerik, the head of NYPD on September 11th, the police commissioner under Giuliani on September 11th, and who was in Israel in the weeks right before September 11th, talking about counterterrorism, supposedly. So maybe
it's funny how Kerik was in Israel in the weeks prior to 9/11, and I believe in the weeks just preceding 11/9, Giuliani was in Israel as a cybersecurity representative for the incoming Trump administration. So,
ooh, interesting observation, Greg. Yes. So I just want to briefly read to give some background on this Bernie Kerik situation. There's this, it's what do 9/11 and Belgian bombings have in common? Bernie Kerik towing the terror line covering for Mossad. On Sunday, September 16, 2001, Kerik announced the discovery of one of the alleged hijackers' passports on the streets of New York. According to him, a passerby came across the passport, quote, several blocks, unquote, from the crash site. This was the passport of Satam al-Sukami. The, quote, passerby, unquote, who allegedly discovered and turned in the passport was never identified. Here's an image of the pristine passport in question. And it talks about the story behind the passport and how it seems like it was obviously planted. And it talks about the lead counsel for the 9/11 Commission, Susan Ginsburg, noted that the passport had been, quote, manipulated in a fraudulent manner in ways that have been associated with al-Qaeda, unquote. The motive is clear. Four of the hijackers of Flight 11, which crashed into the first tower on 9/11, were initially identified as Abdul al-Omari, Amer Kamfar, Amir Bukhari, and Adnan Bukhari. They weren't brothers. Their names were even on the flight manifest. Adnan was a flight instructor at Flight Safety in Vero Beach. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this. We'll get back into this whole aspect of the quote-unquote hijacker operation. But here we go. Was the alleged passerby even real, or were they a figment of Kerik's imagination? We know what Kerik would say to all of this. According to him, conspiracy theorists are, quote, retarded, unquote. But Kerik is one to talk. He's been called a quote-unquote hero of 9/11, and he was Bush's top pick for head of Homeland Security. In 2003, he received a multi-million-dollar contract to train Iraqi police. Now, on a side, remember that you pointed out yesterday, Greg, that this connection to Greenberg, to Hank Greenberg, the head of AIG, and tied into this Council for the National...
It was his son, actually. His son was the CEO of AIG on... Oh, no, I'm sorry. I apologize. He was Greenberg's head of AIG. It was his son was the head of CEO of Marsh McLennan on the morning of September 11th, at the time of 9/11.
Exactly. And then you pointed out that I believe probably the managing director, Paul Bremer, who was missed the work or missed the meeting somehow and ended up on live television giving us the Ehud Barak line about what September 11th was and who did it. That Bremer ended up being the head of the Coalition Provision Authority in Iraq. So we also have these, these networks, these circles here. So Carrick goes from 9/11 Manhattan geography to training police in Iraq. It's similar, it looks like, to someone like Paul Bremer. And by that way, that the elder Greenberg, Hank Greenberg, almost became the CIA director decades ago, but was also the former head, I believe, of the New York Federal Reserve, where there are serious stories about the collaboration with elements within the New York Federal Reserve in relationship to money laundering in relationship to the Russian Jewish mob. So that there's a tight conjunction of sort of mob action here, I would say, too. So back to this article, in 2003, he received a multi-million-dollar contract to train Iraqi police, but military officials later said, quote, his whole contribution was a waste of time and effort, unquote. Carrick wasn't just incompetent, he was also a criminal, engaged in corruption and conspiracies of his own. In 2006, he pleaded guilty to 2 ethics violations, and in 2009 pleaded guilty to 8 federal charges. By doing so, investigators were willing to overlook his other alleged wrongdoings, mortgage fraud, tax fraud, conspiracy to eavesdrop, lying on his Homeland Security application. I mean, by the way, doesn't this just sound like the current situation with people like Paul Manafort? And by the way, the key character in the mix here, too, is once again Giuliani, right? But there's more to the story of his tax fraud. Back to the story here. According to the New York Times, he received a, quote, loan, single quote, scare quote, loan for $250,000 to renovate his Bronx apartment from a New Jersey company, Interstate Industrial Corporation, which has been accused of ties to organized crime. In return for their work, they allegedly wanted a little, single quote, help obtaining a city license. After coming under scrutiny for the single quote loan in 2005, Carrick apparently repaid the money. But that doesn't give the whole story. Another New York Times piece gives more detail. In filing the charges, prosecutors with the United States Attorney's Office declined to identify, quote, wealthy Israeli industrialist, unquote, said to have financed the loan, or to name the, quote, Brooklyn businessman, unquote, said to have served as an intermediary in the transaction, referring to them only as John Doe number 7 and John Doe number 8. But interviews with people who have been briefed on the transaction indicate that the industrialist was an Israeli billionaire and philanthropist Eitan Wertheimer, whose family's vast holdings include companies with the United States Defense Department contracts. The Brooklyn businessman was Shimon Cohen, a marble and stone merchant who has been a friend of Mr. Carrick's for several years. Mr. Wertheimer and Mr. Cohen declined to speak about the loan or the reasons it was made to Mr. Carrick. 2 years ago, though, Mr. Cohen was interviewed by city investigators and described the 2003 loan as an informal transaction. He said that in handing the money over, he had not discussed any interest with Mr. Carrick nor set any timetable for the repayment. The $250,000 loan to Mr. Carrick was provided in a personal check written by Mr. Cohen to Mr. Carrick's wife. There was no written agreement that outlined the terms of the loan. And just a little bit more here. The indictment says that the money actually came from the wealthy industrialist from whom Mr. Cohen had borrowed the funds. Prosecutors have not offered any explanation as to what might have brought about the transaction or why Mr. Wertheimer did not provide the funds directly. Mr. Wertheimer met Mr. Carrick through Mr. Cohen, a longtime friend, according to associates, and the two spent time together during Mr. Carrick's trip to Israel in August 2001. Later that year, as he left his New York City police post, Mr. Carrick handed out 19 gold and blue enamel badges that declared the recipients, quote, honorary police commissioners, unquote. And Mr. Wertheimer received one, as did Mr. Berman and Judith Reagan, then Mr. Carrick's lover and publisher. Okay, then it talks about his tryst with Reagan, apparently in a local apartment. Then it says the real estate developer Stephen C. Witkoff, who is listed in the indictment as John Doe number 5, who paid more than $236,000 in rent for Mr. Carrick from 2001 to 2003, also received one of the badges. In Israel, Mr. Wertheimer serves as chairman of Iskar Limited, a privately held metal cutting tool business that is one of Israel's largest companies and one that sold 80% of its stock last year to Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. The indictment referred to him as an industrialist whose companies, quote, did business with the federal government, unquote. Wertheimer, because it's like they're German Jews, I think is the background of the father. Was chairman for metal cutting tool business Iskar Limited, one of Israel's largest companies. His father, Steph, former Knesset member and notorious free enterpriser, that's in single quotes, also happens to be the second richest man in Israel. But did you catch that bit about a trip to Israel in August 2001 where he met with his money man Wertheimer? He traveled there for 4 days at the end of August, video footage here, and you'll never guess why. Okay, I should read a little bit more of this, and I will, but I also want to pick back up on this Wertheimer connection that I believe is also pretty directly a Talpiot program connection. And so isn't this interesting here that these two main people who gave these loans, so-called, to Bernard Carrick, who became the key operative on the ground in the wake of September 11th in relationship to police action, faithful police action regarding Israeli operatives that were apparently trying to make things even worse than killing thousands of people and destroying buildings, that he was in the key place to make sure that this was brushed under the rug and these people subsequently sent home by higher-ups, it looks like. But let me just finish up a little bit here. Back to this article. Shalom, Bernie. Police Commissioner Bernard Carrick leaves tonight for a 4-day trip to Israel, where he will meet with government officials to discuss anti-terror tactics and Israeli traffickers of ecstasy pills. I think this is quoting another article called Shalom, Bernie. Israeli traffickers of ecstasy pills. Carrick was invited to the violence-racked region by Israel's Minister of Public Safety. Mayor Giuliani approved the trip. The visit is considered official business, so New York City taxpayers are picking up the tab. Carrick is not bringing any NYPD terrorist or narcotics experts with him. Referring to the ecstasy issue, Carrick said, quote, I think I'll be giving them information with regard to seizures we've had and intelligence we've had on narcotics trafficking and see if we can coordinate better or work better together to address some of these issues. There have been several federal and state prosecutions of drug dealers who are Israeli nationals, but authorities believe Israel is a transshipment point rather than a producer of the pills. Carrick himself is no stranger to the Middle East and traveled to Israel before becoming commissioner. Before joining the NYPD, he coordinated security for the Saudi royal family. While in Israel, Carrick had this to say. Carrick was in Jerusalem yesterday to discuss common concerns, including terrorism and narcotics trafficking, with Israeli Police Commissioner Shlomo Aharonishki. Quote, I thought that if I'm going to come, this is the time to come and send a clear message. You can't be intimidated by terrorism, unquote, he said after the meeting. Quote, people shouldn't be afraid to come to Israel, unquote. Carrick also assured Israeli leaders that the NYPD will remain on alert for attacks on Jewish institutions in New York as long as Israeli-Palestinian fighting continues. The department is working with the FBI and the New York State Police on an anti-terrorism task force and is on top of all potential threats, Carrick said. Quote, we've been on what we call enhanced alert for the past several months since the violence broke out here several months ago, and we've been doing just fine, he said. That alert status will remain as is until further notice, unquote. And then it goes all into this whole issue of the ecstasy pills and the DEA agents and that whole DEA report about the Israeli spies and how the Mossad was always tracking the alleged hijackers. It refers to Ryan Dawson's documentary, The Empire Unmasked. So there's a lot more here. And then right down here it says, coincidentally, Eitan Wertheimer, whom Carrick visited 2 weeks before 9/11 and who later loaned, quote unquote, loaned him $250,000, has been on the board of governors for the Jewish agency since 2004. In addition to the arrest of the 5 dancing Israelis pulled over because of the be on the lookout for their van, numerous reports on 9/11 said police also arrested 2 or 3 men, Israelis, in a van near the George Washington Bridge that was full of explosives. The men in the van were arrested. At a press conference on 9/11, Giuliani passed off all questions relating to the Israelis and the other moving vans associated with them to Carrick, who did his best to evade and obfuscate, denying the presence of explosives and avoiding any mention of the fact that the men arrested were all Israelis. And there's more here, but I just want to jump into this question of the Wertheimer connection to Talpiot, because I believe, isn't this interesting, like I said before, that these two connections here, Steve Witkoff and Wertheimer, are connections to 9/11 and 11/9 via Witkoff and Trump, but then also Talpiot and 9/11. So very, very interesting, directly coming up, allegedly out of the FBI's Able Danger investigation. So,
all this is just coincidental, though. I mean, the New York Police Commissioner visiting Israel just before September 11th and hobnobbing with all the high-ranking Israeli officials to discuss terrorism, counter-terrorism techniques. It's all just coincidental, I'm sure.
And isn't it interesting, too, that in reading through that, it mentioned that Warren Buffett had bought the Wertheimer's machining company. And by the way, they also have a company called Blades that creates things for like jet engines.
There were a lot of influential figures that could very well have been related to the events of September 11th from a domestic perspective. Were at the I believe it's the Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, which is right in Buffett's home territory. I believe he was hosting a lot of these. What was the direct specifics behind that?
Yeah, he was. There was Buffett, I believe, was hosting a VIP golfing event that invited a lot of the high-profile CEOs. Some of them who apparently would have been at the World Trade Center that day. So, here's an article from Hadassah magazine in 2007, November 12th. Feature the $4 billion man, and they're talking about the Wertheimer father. And Wertheimer's reach extends beyond industry. On the road to Tefen is Kfar Vradim, the Rose Garden village. Set up by Wertheimer, the upscale town is a model community with an array of services, a well-groomed place where even the municipal garbage dumpsters are hidden. Okay, skipping forward. An educational network that spans the entire region, also spearheaded by Wertheimer, offers mentoring for older entrepreneurs and post-high school and post-army vocational training. Quote, many hundreds of people, both children and adults, unquote, go through the schools each year, says Dan Sharon, who became head of Wertheimer's educational services 2 decades ago. And it talks about these network of roads and the superhighway and any improvements not directly financed by Wertheimer can be attributed to the impact of the industrialization he has brought to the area. The developments of the last 20 years may only be the start. According to Wertheimer's son Eitan, 53, who now runs the family empire, much of the money from the Iskar sale will be invested in the region. Quote, there are a lot of empty mountaintops here, unquote, he was quoted as saying in the Hebrew press, though he has said it is still too early to talk about plans for building in any particular area. Okay, now here, craggy and still sharp at 81, the elder Wertheimer now concentrates on making his vision of what he calls, quote, the third stage of Zionism, unquote, come true. The first stage, he explains, was establishing agriculture. The second was building the military so Israel has the capacity to defend itself. And the third is region-wide economic renewal and industrialization, making things the world needs. Quote, a basic problem of traditional Jewish society, says Wertheimer, a widower with 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, was that people knew things, but they did not know how to make things, unquote. Okay, almost there. His long-term goal is to create an economic powerhouse that enriches the entire Middle East for Jews as well as Arabs. Quote, if we don't help our neighbors, we will create envy, but if we show the Arabs how to be part of the world, to sell products in Japan and buy in America, the commerce and global thinking we create will be tools for people to work together, unquote, says Wertheimer Wertheimer, who outlined his ideas for what he calls, quote, a Middle East Marshall Plan, unquote, in a speech to the United States Congress in 2002. Quote, people are dangerous when they have nothing to lose, unquote, he says. To this end, he has established an industrial park at Gebze, Turkey. Plans for similar parks in Jordan and near Rafah on the Israeli-Palestinian Authority border have been sidetracked by politics. Quote, someone told me that Wertheimer had made an accounting that if you take 40 dunams of olive trees, you can, with difficulty, support one family, unquote, says Sharon. This is Dan Sharon. His director of educational program, who served as director general of the education ministry and was a founder of the Israeli Army's prize Talpiot technology development program. Okay, so there you go. And if you go look in Jason Gewertz's book, Israel's Edge, the story of the IDF's most elite unit, on page 24, it describes who Dan Sharon is. Fortunately, the first commander of Talpiot was an indomitable personality, Dan Sharon. His war experience had taught him that there was a need for such a program well before the idea began taking off. On the first day of fighting in the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian warplanes fired Russian-made Kelt missiles at his base. The Kelts were precursors to today's cruise missiles, boasting pinpoint accuracy. And then you skip ahead. Sharon was a longtime friend of Felix Dotan. They used to meet on Fridays for a spot of brandy. He was very eager to help Dotan, so when the program was finally accepted in 1978, Dotan asked him to lead Talpiot, and Sharon accepted. He had just completed his PhD dissertation at Hebrew University on the, quote, development of thinking and how one can improve his or her own thinking, unquote. So there you go. This is who the loyal aspects of the FBI believe were connected to the New York aspect of the 9/11 operations, was these networks tied in to Bernard Kerik, and then obviously through Giuliani, but then also back into Israeli industrialists connected, directly connected to the origins of the Talpiot program. So, final thing in terms of this story, and then I'll give it over to you, Greg, to wrap it up around some other issues, is this question of Steve Witkoff. And I mentioned briefly this article mentioning he and his sons in relationship to the inauguracy. So I just want to read really briefly. Witkoff's talk, Inauguration Presidency over Lunch in D.C., I read this last time. Howard Lorber, Nicholas Mastroianni also stopped by the Café du Parc on Thursday. Developer Steve Witkoff's sons, Alex and Zach, were sorting through packets of various credentials and tickets for inaugural events. They were all planning to attend a candlelight dinner at Union Station Thursday night, a private event for donors to Donald Trump's inauguration committee. Quote, he's been a friend of mine for 30 years, and it's going to be a very proud moment for me.
Bet Lou Eisenberg there. I would have a pretty safe bet Louis Eisenberg, Mr. Port Authority, was probably there since it involved the inaugural committee. So
there you go. For seeing him sworn in, Steve Witkoff said over bread, I think the country was looking for a real change where someone would finally make decisions. One thing I know about Donald Trump is he's a decision maker, unquote. Witkoff believes New York City real estate will benefit from Trump's policies, especially if he repeals Dodd-Frank. The law was enacted after the 2008 financial crisis to, among other things, protect against predatory lending, and has made it more difficult for banks to invest directly in real estate and CMBS. Experts say it will be difficult for Trump to entirely gut the legislation. Quote, I think New York City real estate benefits the minute Dodd-Frank is defanged, disemboweled, he said over Salmon. Finally, we've got the loudest voice out there, President-elect Trump saying it's got to go, unquote. Quote, regulation is so excessive, it's making it difficult to conduct ordinary course of business, unquote, Alex Witkoff added. And just by the way, this is, I think this is hinting at this whole idea of the way that there's a cutout in the Patriot Act also that has exempted close analysis of things like real estate transfers. So the real estate, as we've seen from this whole, decades long background of Donald Trump, is the perfect operation to launder millions, if not billions of dollars of mobbed up money. So that's what I think this represents. And so in the final paragraph, it says, the discussion at some point turned to the fact that the Witkoffs seemed to me be missing their credentials for the inaugural Liberty Ball. No matter, everyone seemed to agree perhaps a call to Charlie Kushner could help. sort it out. So, Greg, we have
Yeah,
about
good.
4 minutes left. Do you want to touch on this other topic?
Yeah, just a little bit. And this is, I guess, we always can go back and discuss and go back to this topic. And I thank you for breaking all that down. I mean, I think in the between this and I think this article that you read from a couple weeks ago regarding the Wayne Madsen article regarding how Israeli fingerprints are basically all over the hijackers, the Saudi hijackers, which is used as by the proponents of the Saudis did it narrative, or the way to portray just simply it was, if there were aspects of the U.S. government, it was only that they, the whole Saudi Arabia narrative. So between those two articles and some of these dots here with Witkoff and a lot of these other figures you just talked about, and the correlation between the Giuliani, Carrick, and Israelis obviously coordinating at levels just prior to September 11th. I think that this is all vitally important. So I thank you for reading from these articles. These have been excellent finds on your part, and I think we have a great ability to take other people's work and I think in some ways expand upon it and look at it like, look at these articles with some benefit of hindsight, and also looking at current events, and you just see just how important these articles are. So I'm glad we're able to do that here on the Antedote. And I guess for the last couple of minutes, I wanted to discuss and we can go back to this as well, a very interesting, it's not necessarily a direct connection to anything in particular, but it does, I think this speaks volumes about the continuity of the various networks that are involved in shaping a lot of the conservative right-wing nationalist Zionism narrative on both a domestic scale as well as a foreign scale. And that was recently at the I don't know if it's a banquet. It was an annual event that the Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum holds. Phyllis Schlafly is like the queen bee of the modern conservative movement, and she was one of the first major figures to endorse Donald Trump for president. She passed away a couple years ago. And anyway, this event was done in conjunction, by the way, with the Gateway Pundit. It was, of course, the head of the Gateway Pundit, Jim Hoft, who was seated standing at the table with Benjamin Netanyahu and Andrew Breitbart during the event where Breitbart was conceived in Israel, as the article by Breitbart CEO Larry Solov laid out. So at this event, General Flynn was awarded the John Singlaub Award for service to America. And I find this interesting because you go back to John Singlaub. Singlaub is one of the foremost figures, I think, in terms of the modern right-wing movement from a military perspective. He was head of the very influential Western Goals Foundation, and he was heavily involved in the Contra efforts in Nicaragua, and the whole Iran-Contra would have very much had Singlaub would have had a key role in that. And of course, Singlaub worked very closely with one Oliver North. And I find this interesting because in tying these networks back, you think about Oliver North. Oliver North currently the head of the National Rifle Association. And we
30
know
seconds
that,
left, Greg.
Okay. Anyway, I think when you look at this, when you take into the Singlaub connection, I think what you're seeing here is a continuing nexus between the anti-communist warriors and the pro-Russia under Putin revitalists. And so you take connect these dots together, and I think you can go back with the whole Greenberg Council for National Interest, and you do see a Russian element to this overall 9/11 operation. Then you can tie in the figures that go way back prior to, such as General Singlaub and those who were pushing the hardcore anti-communist Cold War narrative in terms of the.
We're at the end, Greg. I'm sorry. We'll return to this in the future because it's an important narrative. And by the way,
you're not my supervisor. This God gave
this frail an ancient land to me. And when the morning sun rebuilds the hills and
Can I see a land where children can run free? So take my hand and walk this land with me, and walk this lovely land with me. I'm just a man when you are by my side. Oh, with the help of Almighty God, I know I can be strong. So take my hand and walk on this land with me, and walk this lovely, lovely land with me. Though I am just a man, when you are by